This morning we continue with our examination of the book of Job by moving into a new phase now of this book, a new section. Chapter 32 begins now, I think, a new phase of this book. And so it would be appropriate for us at this point to pause and reflect upon where we've come from. We're 32 chapters in, right? So it seems reasonable to rewind a bit and consider what we have seen so far. In the first part of chapter 1, namely the first 5 verses, we are introduced to Job, a man who is both wealthy and righteous. He is wealthy in the sense that he has much in terms of material prosperity, but he is also a righteous man. We are told that he regularly, for example, would offer sacrifices on behalf of his children in the event that during the course of their parties, that they would that they might blaspheme the name of the Lord, and so he would offer sacrifice on their behalf to God to be sure that they were kept from his wrath. So we're introduced to a man who is both wealthy and righteous. But then in chapter 1, verse 6, and going all the way through chapter 2, verse 10, we are given a glimpse into the two heavenly councils that take place, in which God invites his angelic messengers, his angelic host, to come into his presence. Satan invited as well, being a member of that company. And in each of these heavenly councils that takes place, it is God who points to Job and proclaims him as righteous. Now, I've said many times, this is not an observation on the part of God. This is a proclamation by God. Have you considered my servant Job, a man who is blameless and upright, who fears God and shuns evil? This is the man, this is God's declaration upon him. Now, Satan, of course, questions this reality of the righteousness of Job, and God allows him to attack Job. You remember, first economically, materially, and then secondly, physically, upon his very person, attacking his very flesh. But as we come out of that little bit, you remember that we know something as we look at this book, that Job's righteousness is the declaration and purpose of God. And nothing Satan can do will change it. Nothing Satan can do to the material nature or the physical nature of Job is going to change his state before God. He is a man proclaimed by God to be righteous. That's the point of this story. It is God's intention to use Satan to demonstrate his, that is God's, own purposes over Job. And that's the key, by the way, to really understanding this book, is to recognize what it is that God is doing in these two great councils. Which leads then to chapter 3. Now we get to this place where Job is responding to this reality. And you remember that in chapter 3, he gives an initial lament in response to the attack that's come upon him. He laments even having been born. Remember, he cries about having even been born, or to having to experience such things in this life. His reaction to his suffering flows out of his concupiscence. It flows out of the tendency of the flesh, even in the righteous man, to doubt the goodness of God in the midst of suffering. It is the natural tendency of human beings, even though we know we're loved by God, to question whether God loves us. The concupiscence of the flesh continues to struggle even in the righteous man. So Job demonstrates that he is a man. Okay? He is a normal, ordinary human being, righteous, but still struggles with the realities of living in this fallen world. Which then opens the door to the longest section of this book, which we've been working our way through, chapters 4 through 25. A series of speeches given by Job's supposed friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar each attempt to persuade Job that his suffering has been caused by his own sin. It's your fault, Job, is basically what they're saying. What they're arguing is if you will simply go to the deity and confess before the deity of what you have done, your suffering will be abated. And you remember this series of speeches, chapter 4 to 25, runs through 3 rounds of speeches. And each time that one of Job's friends will speak, Job will then respond to his speech. And along the way, he will continually assert his own righteousness. He will assert that, no, I have not done something that has caused me to suffer in this way. And more specifically, as we go through the speeches, what you see is the growth of Job over time, as his understanding of the situation seems to grow as to the real intention of God behind his situation. Now, remind you of something that Calvin said in his 159 sermons from this book. Although their conclusions are wrong, Job's friends do make some good points along the way. They do articulate the reality that God is just and his justice must be satisfied and sin must be dealt with. That's true. But his conclusions come out wrong. Their conclusions, as I say, come out wrong. They don't take that, they take it to a simplistic conclusion, a far too simplistic conclusion, which I just gave you a minute ago. So, through these speeches, we have seen Job's friends, I should say, try to argue this simplistic point, and Job trying to refute it, but at the same time struggling with how to understand this in the larger sense. It seems as though, as Calvin says, that Job makes good arguments rather poorly. Okay? And Calvin notes that Job's friends make bad points rather well, but Job makes rather good points rather poorly along the way. And so you have this mix going on in this, and it's a struggle to get through all of that, because you see Job trying to deal with. Now, Job's friends are easy, right? They say the same thing again and again and again and again. That's easy, all right. But Job is kind of all over the place, all right? The good news is that will begin to change. Now, in chapters 26 to 31 then, after the rounds of speech are over, Job will make his final appeal, and we looked at that just recently. He will again assert his own righteousness, that he has not sinned to deserve suffering, and he will continue to lament that he has no way to defend his cause before an infinite God. He will continue to say, how can I possibly justify myself before God? But Job, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of making his good points from a good foundation rather poorly, he comes to recognize something that even was noted in the songs that we sung this morning and the ideas that we had within the lyrics. No one can counsel God in how he is to think or act. We don't get the right to tell God how to think. We don't get the right to tell God what to do. We don't get the right. Job is beginning to realize this in all of this situation. And I would also remind you that Job is a man of his time. Okay, it's always important to keep in mind when you're reading a passage of Scripture. Put these men in their time frame. Where is Job? Well, Job is a man of his time. He does not know the fullness of the biblical revelation available to us. We have 4,000 years of history from him, a couple thousand years of church history, and a scripture, a fully written scripture, for us to look at Job through. He does not. So he's living in a very different time. He's living in a very different case. For example, he does not understand, or thinks, in essence, that God is basically ignoring him. Right? He's trying to make a case. I'm just, let me prove it, but no one will answer me. No one will justify me. My friends certainly aren't going to do it. They think I'm guilty of something. And God doesn't seem to want to do so. And so he's left in this situation of thinking, well, God's basically just out there watching from a distance. He does not recognize, as we do, that God has taken notice of the state of human beings. I mean, the very heavenly counsel that you saw earlier, it is God who is pointing out Job, right? Now, Job doesn't know that, but we do. But we also know that God has taken notice of this creation by entering into it himself. You see, Job would not have understood that, but we do. We do. We understand that God himself walked into his, well, entered in through birth into his creation, became a man and lived amongst us so that he could experience the reality of this world. We are looking then back at Job and saying, hey, Job, God has taken notice of you. So we've seen that as we've gone through these sets of speeches. So here's how I would summarize all of these speeches. Now, this was hard to write, but here's what I think is taking place. Job is afflicted by God through Satan to demonstrate an eternal purpose. And Job and his friends are trying to figure out what it all means. But in the end, the friends' assertion is demonstrated to be false and rejected. But while Job's response grows, settling more and more into the sovereignty of God, he still comes up short in discerning its eternal purpose. He still doesn't quite get there yet. There's still more to go. Thus, we have more of this book to continue in. For example, I'll say, so Job seems to justify himself over the sovereign purposes of God. That it's all about Job, rather than the sovereignty of God in display in him. It's all about Job. Now, that's an important point I want you to remember, because it's going to come up very significantly in the chapters we're going to be entering into now, which is the entry of another man into the discussion. A man by the name of Elihu. Elihu comes up in the discussion starting in chapter 32. Now, I have you note a few things first before we actually get into the speech of Elihu. So bear with me for a bit. This introduction is going to be a little long. You will notice, if you're using a modern version other than the King James, you will notice that the first verses of chapter 32, particularly the first 5 verses, are written in narrative form. Or they're structured in your Bible in narrative form, rather than the poetic form that you've gotten used to over the last 20-some chapters of this book, right? It's written in narrative form. The author inserts here an historical note. He puts in at this point an historical point to explain the appearance and substance of Elihu. You see it? So he's going to insert here. Now, if I am correct that it was Job who wrote this book, seems most reasonable to me, then it's Job himself who inserts this little phrase right about here to describe what's about to take place, inserting a biographical note of this man. We know from verse 2 that Elihu is a Buzite. I love saying that, a Buzite. Buzz, not Lightyear, just Buzz, was a nephew of Abraham through his brother Nahor. You find that in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 21. How it is exactly that Elihu and Abraham are connected is still anyone's guess. But the most literal interpretation of this is that Elihu is from the line of the nephew of Abraham through his brother Nahor. Genesis chapter 2. Now, this again puts Job in the time frame of the days of Abraham, right? There's an example of where this book fits in human history. Elihu is the only Hebrew name in this book. Elihu is the only Hebrew name in this book. And the word Elihu literally means he is God, or Yahweh is God. More inclined to see it as he is God. By the way, he's the son of a man by the name of Barachel. Barachel means may God bless. Okay, so what you see here is that, implying to me anyways, that the author is looking at Elihu as a very unique character. He's unique by name. He's unique by the implication of his name. He's unique by the implication of his father's name. There's something about this man that sets him apart and makes him different from everyone else. And we'll come back to what that means in a minute. Now, this man, Elihu, has obviously been sitting with Job and his friends and listening to the speech of both, of all of them. He's been listening. He's been sitting there. It's obvious. Now, there's no other mention of him in the book prior to this, right? We've not seen his name before. So we must assume, we have no choice but to assume that he arrived as one of Job's friends. I mean, what other conclusion could we draw? Here he is. He's about to comment on all of what these men have said. So it seems reasonable that he's been sitting there the whole time, listening to what's been taking place. The implication being that he's included in Job's friends, but is never named. Could be that Job says, I ain't even going to even let anyone know that he was there until this point, because I'm making a point with that. And we learn from verse 4 of this little biography that he waits to speak because he is the youngest amongst them. The first part of his speech, verses 6 to 22, is an apologetic for his age over their, that is Job and his friends, over their seeming wisdom. Over their seeming wisdom. We'll get to that in a second. And he responds in the course of his speech to all of their assertions. He will address both Job and his friends for the theories they have put forth throughout the 3 rounds of their speeches. All right, so he's going to he's going to insert himself into the assertions that are made by all of the men during the course of their speeches. See, the author even tells us up front why Elihu will speak. And he gives great hints in verses 2 through 5 as to what his speech will include. Even before he recounts it, even before he writes it down, he tells us what Elihu's going to say. You see it? So the writer of this book inserts this historical narrative in the midst of it in order to say, listen up, because this is what's coming. Okay? Now, we are told in 3 places, verse 2, 3, and 5, that Elihu burns with anger. Some translations, he's filled with wrath. I think I even like that even better. He's filled with wrath. And he's filled with wrath that both sides are wrong. He's angry that both sides are wrong. He's angry at Job because, it says in verse 2, he justified himself rather than God. In other words, Elihu is going to tell us that Job is more concerned about his own situation and his own answers than he is about God's intentions. Now, Calvin's translation at this point, which was probably a vernacular form of the Latin Vulgate at this time, would be my guess, all right? Calvin, living in the 16th century, would probably would have had potentially a vernacular version, a French version maybe, or even potentially a Germanic version of a translation of the Latin Vulgate. It's possible that Calvin is even reading directly from the Latin Vulgate here. But in Calvin's translation, the phrase, he justified himself rather than God, is translated as, he said he was more righteous than God. I find that to be an interesting twist on that phrase. And I did a little Hebrew word study. I know zip about Hebrew, but I did a little Logos examination of Hebrew. And I think the translation that Calvin has is actually much better than even the one in the ESV, in the sense that he was claiming, or he was putting, the importance of his own righteousness above that which God intended over him. Okay, so his focus in all of his justifications, all the way through the speeches we've just looked at, all of his protestations of righteousness are from Elihu's perspective to be more important than God's intention in that righteousness. All right, so that's going to give us a clue, I think, as to where Elihu's going to go here and what he's really going to be saying to us in terms of why he disagrees with Job. So he burns with anger at Job because he thinks that Job is making himself to be more important and his own righteousness to be even more important than the intentions of God. He's also, as we learn in verse 3, angry at the friends because he says they found no answer. We've already made that point, have we not? That these men have no idea. They assume the simplistic and erroneous view that Job suffers just because of his own sin, right? Look, the reason why you're in pain is because you did something. Go to God, confess it, everything will be copacetic. Everybody knows that's way too simplistic because the world doesn't work that way. We live every day in a world where the wicked thrive and the righteous suffer, all right? We don't have an explanation that simplistic. Now, you will notice in verse 1 it says that these three men, that would be Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, that these three men ceased to answer Job. They ceased to answer because they cannot fend off his assertion of his own righteousness. I would call verse 1 an implication that Job's three friends throw a temper tantrum here. If you're not going to listen to us, we're not going to talk anymore. Basically, that's what they're saying. And so the writer puts that in here because those three men are going to stop talking. We're not going to hear from them again. In fact, the only mention of their names again is going to be when God condemns them in chapter 42. So they stop speaking. Now, let me just pause for a moment and remind you, as I've said a number of times along the way, for Job to be righteous in his own eyes is not to assume that he believes he is self-righteous. Okay, that's not the assertion. When we talk about somebody being righteous in their own eyes, we're assuming that he's some sort of proud person in his own righteousness, that he thinks his own righteousness is important. That's not really what Job has been saying. Job has been speaking of himself as righteous, but not as a profligate being punished. Okay, so he's not making this assertion that I'm so righteous that I could never have sinned. Even he himself has already admitted a few times, has he not, of his own sin. So this is not Job making the argument along the way that I'm so righteous that God would never smote me in any sort of way. No, that's not really what that means. It's a difference of understanding the relative nature of this situation. Okay, righteousness is a relative term, as we understand it. So Elihu is angry at Job, and he's angry at Job's friends. But there will also be anger from God in all of this. I'll insert that here because it seems reasonable to bring it up, that in chapter 42 and verse 7 it says that God will also burn with anger. But in this case, not against Job, but rather his friends. And when we get to chapter 42, we will notice that God will say to these three men, listen, you better ask Job to go make a sacrifice for you, because if he doesn't make a sacrifice for you, you're dead. Which I find amazingly ironic. So there will be anger from Elihu. There will be anger from God as well. But it's interesting that when God becomes angry against the three friends of Job, it may be implying that Elihu may be missing some of what Job has been arguing. Because God is going to immediately respond after this speech. And I find that interesting. It could be that God's perspective is infinitely higher than the five of them put together. Right? Yeah. Now, the question that plagues commentators of this book is, why is Elihu's speech included here? Why is it here? There have been a number who have asked me along the way, what do you think Elihu is saying in all of this? You know, my response is to look at them and go, I don't know, we'll get there. But here we are. So, what possible reasons would it be for the author of this book to have included the speech of Elihu here? Well, let me give you a couple of different reasons that I found from various sources along the way, and I've modified these a little bit from my own examination of the book. Number one, Elihu may serve in some small measure as the intermediary or vindicator that Job has been looking for. Remember, Job continually was asking for someone to take up his case before God. We saw it in chapter 16, verses 18 to 21. We saw it in chapter 19 and in chapter 23. But I'd have you look specifically at chapter 19, where he says in verses 23 to 25, he says, "Oh, that my words were written, oh, that they were inscribed in a book, oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth." I'm looking for someone to vindicate me. Remember? We looked at this as Job saying, who is going to take up my case? Who is going to talk for me? Who is going to defend me? I mean, it's 3 against 1 here. I got 3 men that are arguing a simplistic point and no one's disagreeing with them. Who's going to take up my case? It's possible that maybe the writer is inserting Elihu here to be somewhat of a vindicator of Job. Now, it doesn't really work out that way because Elihu will not actually become Job's vindicator. But, and in fact, Elihu is even going to go so far as to castigate Job, as I already said. But he does seem to point Job in the right direction. Right? That's one possibility. Another possibility, and one that I find fascinating, is that Elihu may be adding inspiration to this situation. He may be adding inspiration to this situation. If you look at verse 8 of chapter 32, the chapter we're going to start into. Verse 8, "But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand." Isn't that interesting? Elihu says, look, the reason why, where we get our answers from God. We get it from His Word. He speaks to us. And so it seems as though Elihu is bringing some inspiration to the situation, even though all of the speeches up to this point are based largely on tradition and observation. Tradition and observation. Well, this is the world in which we live, right? The wicked always get what they deserve. That was the observation of Job's friends. And Job's is, well, wait a second. I'm observing my own life and experiencing righteousness, but I don't see that being true. In other words, there's been no appeal here anywhere along the way to an inspiration. There's suggestions of it, but not really an appeal to it. Would it look as though Elihu is going to add inspiration into this book? In fact, Elihu seems to bring God's own words, you might call it a prophetic voice, into the conversation, which is borne out by the fact that God speaks next. So Elihu speaks, and then God just picks up and continues on from where Elihu stops. And there's no little narrative in between. So it's very possible that the writer is inserting here a man who's actually trying to, he will not be all that successful at it, but he is going to try to bring God's own word into this scenario in comparison to just their worldly perspective of tradition and experience. Thirdly, Elihu seems to anticipate and articulate the stance that God Himself will take. Again, if he's speaking in a prophetic voice with some sort of inspiration, it would seem reasonable, wouldn't it, that he would say what God would also say. And he does seem to do that. He rejects the human view given by Job and his friends, and he turns the attention to God's vantage point. So he says, okay, stop thinking about this from your perspective. Let's think about this from God's perspective. So it's an entirely different perspective that he's bringing. And he may even be, as we go through this speech, you will see bits of him actually bringing the very words of God. In fact, there are a number of cases where God himself will quote Elihu along the way. Or could it be that Elihu's quoting God in advance? But fourthly, if nothing else is true, what Elihu does do is he reorients the entire debate. He reorients the entire debate from this point. He turns the focus away from Job to God alone as the grounds of certainty and hope. He turns the attention away from Job and his morality and his suffering and his righteousness, etc. He turns the attention away from Job. The spotlight is removed from Job and now placed upon God, which anybody reading chapters 1 and 2 correctly would also come to realize. This book ain't about Job. Never has been. For the last 20 or so chapters, we've been focusing on Job because these men do nothing but that. But now here comes Elihu, and he's going to reorient the conversation away from Job, away from suffering and the human condition and all these kinds of things. I would argue, by the way, that chapters 32 to 37 of this book put to rest the idea that this book is about how we deal with human suffering. Puts to rest that idea. The common idea, as we've seen very often amongst people who have preached this book, is, well, you go to Job, you learn how to deal with suffering. And Elihu comes along and goes, it ain't about suffering. Never has been. Okay? That's what we're going to see starting here. But that should not lead you to the conclusion that Elihu is some great master of theology. Okay? Which is part of the reason why this speech is so very difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult. In fact, I would argue that this is the most difficult part of this book to fit in. But step back for a moment and recognize that Elihu, like all men, struggles under the same limitation that Job's friends do. He might overstate his contribution a bit. He might overstate his contribution a little bit. See, Elihu knows no more of the actual reasons for Job's suffering than the other actors in the story do. He's not aware of what took place in that heavenly council any more than Job or Eliphaz or Bildad or Zophar are. He knows nothing of all of that. In fact, being young, he seems to have an inflated view of his own wisdom versus theirs, which you could draw the conclusion from this little narrative about, right? He will also, unfortunately, and again, this is the reason why this speech is so difficult, is because some of his arguments will actually overlap with Job's friends. He's actually going to have a tendency to blame suffering on personal sin at times. So he's going to do at times exactly what he contends Job's friends ought not to do. All right? Again, that's what makes this difficult. What is interesting, though, about this, and I think this is a key point, particularly of chapter 33, is that he implies that Job's sufferings are not because of his former sins, but as warnings over possible future sins. So he's going to twist Job's friend's idea, and he's going to say, they're wrong. It's not about sins you've committed. And so, Job, you're right. It's not about sins you've committed. But what if this suffering that you're having is a warning by God to keep you from falling into future sins? It's the same argument, just in reverse. So, again, Elihu doesn't stand out in this book as some master of theology. So he will draw conclusions that are significantly different from God's own reply. Yes, he will say things that God will repeat, but he will also draw conclusions that are significantly different from God's own reply. Now, do you see the irony in that? He's going to speak against Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar and say, you know what, you guys came to the wrong conclusions from what you're saying. But he does precisely the same thing. He takes good points along the way, just as they did, and lumps them together to come to the wrong conclusion himself. So in a sense, he might think he's wiser than his friends, but he demonstrates he's not necessarily wiser than his friends. So he draws conclusions that are significantly different from God's own reply, and God simply ignores Elihu. He simply ignores him. God never mentions his name. He never makes any comment about what this man has just said. He doesn't come and say, see, Job, I sent this man. See, listen to him. Nothing. It's almost as though you could lift out Elihu's speech out of this book entirely, and the book would not change at all. Again, another reason why this speech is so very difficult to get into this situation. So, I will say it like this. Here's the best we can say. Elihu's speech builds suspense by delaying the final outcome. He does not provide any substantial answer to Job, but he does seem to reorient the discussion away from the self-focused perspective of both Job and his friends. In other words, the best we can say is that Elihu seems to reorient the conversation away from God, away from Job and towards God. So, I'll put it like this. These chapters, 32 to 37, Elihu's speech, Elihu is nothing more than the curtain that rises before the main character takes the stage. He's just the curtain. When the curtain starts to go up, the audience's attention turns to the stage. Oh, it's time. But that's it. You don't think about the curtain again after that, do you? So that's all we have here. We have a man who will, in a sense, reorient the conversation, but he's simply reorienting the attention of everyone, including us, to God, who will then come onto the stage. Now, you're probably saying to me, well, then just skip over this part then. No. There are some good things, as I said. Even the three friends of Job got a few things right along the way that we should observe, so we need to do the same thing. We need to do the same thing here. So this speech, and it is a single speech, which starts in chapter 32, verse 6, and goes all the way to the end of 37, is broken up into three parts. The first part of this, chapter 32, which we're going to look at this morning, Elihu gives an apologetic for his speaking over against the wisdom of others, as I said. And then in chapters 33 and 34, part 2, Elihu rebukes Job and makes his case for why Job is actually suffering under the inherent justice of God, or more specifically, as I mentioned earlier, as a warning to future sin. And then in chapters 35 to 37, fitting with the theory I just put before you, Elihu puts Job in his place before a God who is just, with a defense of the greatness and majesty of God himself. So he starts with, I need to speak, and here's why. Second, Job, you're wrong. You're not suffering for what you did in the past. You're probably suffering for what might come in the future as a warning. And then thirdly, and I know that because God is majestic and holy, and that's what he does. See it? Okay, so that's what he's doing. Turning the attention of Job away from himself to the Lord. All right, so let's look at these verses related to the opening act of this speech. Now, as I've already said, verses 1 to 5, Elihu burns with anger because he believes the others are all out to lunch. My words, not his, but close enough. So we come then to his actual apologetic, starting in verse 6. And here's what he says in the second half of verse 6 and into verse 10. I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the Spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me, let me also declare my opinion. Now, Elihu here recognizes that wisdom does not necessarily come from age, but from God. Now, yes, it is true that in that particular day and time, and in fact through many centuries up until like 5 minutes ago, younger men automatically deferred to the wisdom of elders in the community. And the reason is obvious. Well, they've lived longer. They've experienced more things. They've had more opportunities to fall on their faces. And so when they pick themselves up, they can come to us who are young and say, don't do that. Okay? So there was a time like this when younger men would simply say, you know what, I'm going to listen to the elders because they know what they're talking about. They've had time and experience to be able to deal with these things. So they had these things in terms of material wisdom. But spiritual wisdom is not automatically the result of age. Now, you could say amen to that, right? It is possible to be very old in years and still have little knowledge or understanding of the living God. In fact, you could be one who has spent your entire life in the Bible, studying the original languages and all the history and everything about it, and have zip in terms of your understanding of the living God. Age in the spiritual realm is not necessarily a good thermometer of wisdom. See, in the New Testament, we are told that wisdom is the product of the Spirit, what He gives to men. What He gives to men in understanding what cannot be gleaned simply through observation or experience. I mean, even Job and his friends have been dealing with this reality, right? Job's friends. The wicked always get what they deserve. Therefore, you're getting what you deserve. So go confess your sin and everything will be copacetic, right? These men are old, but they're not very wise because that ain't true. In the New Testament, wisdom is a product of the Spirit. He gives it to men in order that they might understand the things of God. Listen to what Paul said to a young man. He said these words in 1 Timothy 4. If you put these things, if you put these truths, these doctrines, this theology before the brothers, you will be a good servant of Christ Jesus, being trained in the words of the faith and of the good doctrine that you have followed. Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. Command and teach these things. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. End quote. Paul says to Timothy, look, you may be a young man, and you may be preaching to men who are older than you, but it doesn't matter, because your wisdom doesn't come from you, or from your experience, or from your age. It comes from the Spirit of God who has given you these truths. Preach them well. I used to have this verse as sort of my life verse. Don't let anyone look down on you because you were young. Doesn't fit anymore. Now I have to say, don't let anybody look down on you because you're getting old. In verse 8 of Job 32, I read before, it says, it is the Spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It's not the old who are wise, right? Over in verse 18, Elihu says, for I am full of words, the Spirit within me constrains me or compels me to speak of what I know. Elihu, I should say, begins his speech in recognizing that it's not just because you guys are old that you know what you're talking about. All right? Your age doesn't make you experts. The expertise of this particular matter has to come from God. That's what he starts with. Now, I do think it's interesting that Elihu doesn't turn and say, yeah, and you know what, I'm smarter than all of you. He doesn't say that. Kind of hints at it, but he doesn't actually say that. He actually does give credit to the Lord for giving him the words to speak. All right, so he's thinking different than all of what we have seen so far in this book. Elihu begins in recognizing the importance of inspiration, of revelation to the conversation. If we're going to glean anything out of this, we have to understand what God is saying. Or let's put it like this. It's never what we believe that matters. It's what God believes that matters. Come to me and say, well, I think this. And I'm going to say, well, good for you. What does God think? What does the Scriptures reveal? And you should say the same thing to me, as the Bereans did to the Apostle Paul. I don't care what you say. What does the Scriptures actually say? What does the Bible teach? Elihu begins in recognizing that fundamental principle as a part of his speech, which leads him to say these words in verses 11 and 12. Behold, I waited for your words. I listened for your wise sayings while you searched out what to say. I gave you my attention, and behold, there was none among you who refuted Job or who answered his words. He condemns the so-called wisdom of Job's friends automatically as hollow words, right? I waited for your words. I gave you my attention. I listened faithfully to your arguments, and I listened and looked for wisdom. I allowed you the opportunity to speak before I did so. But, as he says in verse 15, they are dismayed. They answer no more. They have no word to say. They have nothing to say. Their words are just vapors that have now disintegrated in the sun. You remember, it was Job who cut Bildad off in mid-sentence, you remember? Mid-speech, I should say. Cut him off mid-speech, chapter 26. Elihu suggests that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have nothing more to say because their arguments are shallow and repetitive, and they can't stand before the argument that Job has made. Now, again, Elihu's not going to say that Job is right, but what he is saying to the three men is, he put you in your place, didn't he? You have no answer to him. That's why you're not speaking. I sat and listened to you for however long these speeches took. I sat and listened to you, and I didn't hear one bit of wisdom out of what you said. So Elihu swiftly condemns Job's friends. He sweeps their argument away quickly, and he spends the rest of his speech speaking to Job. He spends the rest of his speech speaking to Job. And chapter 34, verse 2 speaks of wise men, but it's clearly not these three guys. Okay, so Elihu is speaking to wise men in a general sense, but more specifically, he's speaking to Job. So he condemns Job's friend's wisdom. So, you haven't said anything, shut up. All right? Which leads to his words in verse 17 to 21. I will also answer with my share. I will also declare my opinion. For I am full of words. The spirit within me constrains me. Behold, my belly is like wine that has no vent, like new wineskins ready to burst. I must speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I will not show partiality to any man or use flattery toward any person, for I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. Elihu bursts forth with his own opinion, arguing he now has the authority to speak. When he says, my belly is like wine that has no vents, like new wineskins ready to burst in verse 19, it's an image that he paints. It's a picture. It's the picture of new wine fermenting in a wineskin, right? You take some wine, you take some grapes, you stomp them out, you drain them, you put the juice into wineskins, and you wait for that to ferment. As the fermentation process releases its natural gases, the wineskins expand. And sometimes they burst. If they are weak or if they are old, right? Jesus, you remember, used exactly the same imagery in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 17 to describe the new reality in those who are disciples of Christ. You know, you don't put new wine into old wineskins. You put new wine into new wineskins. The similarity being, when the Spirit of God comes, he puts the new nature into new wineskins, not old ones, because it doesn't work. So he puts his new nature into those that he has translated, that he has made new, that he's regenerated by the Spirit of God. They don't have to be part of the old system anymore, right? You don't have to rely on fasting and those sorts of things as you see it. So Elihu uses it as a metaphor for needing to bleed the wineskins. He's the wineskin. God has put into me new wine, and it's fermented in me while I've been sitting here listening to you guys. And so now I need to bleed that out. My thoughts and opinions have been building up, and I need to let them out, he says. But he does say, I will not show partiality to any man or use flattery towards any person. What he is saying is, look, okay, I'm going to speak, but my opinions will cut across everybody's position. I am staking my own place to stand against all of yours. All right, so you can hold your opinions, fine, but I'm going to cut across every single one of them because, frankly, you're all wrong. So Elihu comes now in this chapter and says, it's my turn to speak. It's my turn to speak because I have words from the Almighty. Verse 8. The breath of the Almighty has given me understanding, and so now it's my turn to open my mouth. Now, I want you to see the irony in that. There's a great irony in that. Because what we know now as we look back on this book, particularly chapter 1, verse 8 and chapter 2, verse 3, that it's God's words that have set all this in motion. Right? Have you considered my servant Job? The entirety of this book is based on that phrase, repeated twice. Have you considered my servant Job? Have you, Satan, considered this man? You see, the irony is here's Elihu saying, I have words from the Almighty to speak. But you know what, Elihu? In the end, your words aren't going to mean much. Because the only words that are really going to matter are the words of God himself. He spoke first, and he speaks last. Because he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and everything about this situation is from his mouth. Not yours, Elihu. I find that ironical. If he really is bringing inspiration to the matter, he has missed the point. It's God's declaration of Job as righteous that is the key speech of this book. Just that short little phrase, have you considered my servant Job, right? And what follows. That's the key speech of the book. That's the whole thing that everything is about. Elihu's message is interesting, sure, but it's not going to add to the point. It's not going to change anything, which is the point. Because when God speaks, what comes is, and it can't be changed, no matter how much bloviating we do. It's only what God has revealed that really matters. We can bloviate all we want to, and it might be interesting, and it might be, this and that. But it cannot alter the plans and the purposes that God has established in the world. So maybe, just maybe, once in a while, we ought to just stop talking and let God speak, instead of our opinions filling the airwaves with everything. See? So again, Elihu's going to be interesting, and his speech will be interesting to us. And yes, he will turn our attention to the Lord. But in the end, it's really not going to affect the outcome, because God has spoken. That is our introduction to another speech. that, Lord willing, will not take us too long to get through because, frankly, I don't think it has a whole lot to say, although it does say many good things that we should address.